Yeah, we have a lot of material. Adam and I have been working together for a long time, and we've brought all of our projects today, and we may not get through everything. So if we don't, then we can just stop and continue next time we come.
So to start in the dirty beginning, this is a picture that Ali and I didn't make together but commissioned. It was 2000, August 2000. We were in Rwanda, and it was about 6 years after the genocide. And what was remarkable about being there at that time is during the genocide there must have been 10 to 15,000 journalists in Rwanda. And when we were there, there was still, in the refugee camp that we were in, there was still like 150,000 people, but there were no journalists, and there hadn't been for the last 6 years. And that was one of the things that actually took us there. And when we were there, we met a sign painter, and his name was Lenin, and he was convinced that he could tell the difference between a Hutu and a Tutsi. So we commissioned him to make this painting. And it's just an interesting way to begin, because it's our beginning, but also because I think its theme is very much a concern of ours about photography that remains all through these 15 years we've been working together, which is somehow photography is not only a witness to events like this genocide, but can be complicit in it. That image making can be complicit in something so terrible like that.
And then several years later we were invited to Rwanda. So that image, the last image, was taken on the border of Rwanda and Burundi in a refugee camp. And much later we went to Rwanda, to Kigali. And we went to a number of museums and sites of the genocide in Rwanda. And in the intervening years, a number of museums had been created and a number of memorials had been created to the genocide in Rwanda. And we had a strange experience because we went to some of these places, and they're supposed to be very harrowing experiences, but we actually didn't feel that, they didn't feel very harrowing. And there was one in particular that we went to that was, it had been the scene of a genocide. It was a school full of Tutsi children, and it had been surrounded. It was on a hill, and it had been surrounded, and the Hutu groups had come in and they'd massacred the entire school. And all of these bodies were left on the floor where they'd been found. And to create a memorial, they just sprinkled lime powder on the bodies, and they were just left there. And we photographed this, but it felt to us more like a kind of art installation than a crime scene, strangely. It kind of didn't feel like anything. And we didn't want to even photograph it because it felt like a photograph already. It felt that it had already been represented. And then a couple of days later we were walking around Kigali, and we went into a photography studio, and we found these pictures in the dustbin of the studio. And what they are is, in Rwanda, the way they make a passport photograph is they take a picture of the whole body and then they clip out the head and shoulders. And they were photographing a whole school to make their first passports. And this, for us, somehow captured something about this history of disappearance and death and genocide more than the memorial itself.
So that became one piece of work from a book and kind of museum project called Fig that we did, which comprised of about 200 figures in a museum thing, objects, and this was another one of the objects. And again, one of our struggles is how do you represent the idea of trauma or conflict or agony or pain? And we happened to be in Israel when a very young Palestinian called Amar Alfa, he went to the kind of local market in Tel Aviv, big local market, and he blew himself up, he detonated himself. And one of the remarkable things that Ali and I noticed is that after this detonation, you go there and it was, it was full of evergreen trees, but all the leaves of the trees had been blown off. So you've got this kind of strange scene, it's the middle of summer, but all the trees were devoid of leaves. And we just picked up one, and again that became the kind of the only representation of this event that we included in this project.
So I think what Adam's talking about there is an image of something, but where the thing that you're trying to represent is almost outside the frame. It's outside the frame of the picture. And this is another example of that. I think we mentioned this earlier when we started the workshop yesterday. But on that same trip to Israel, we went to meet Arafat. And Arafat, for those who don't know, was the head of the PLO in Ramallah, and he was living in a compound that he was completely, he was imprisoned essentially in a compound by the Israeli Defense Force. And we went and we met him and we took this quite crappy picture of him, and then and we shot it on a large format camera. And then when we were coming back through the control to England, the Israeli Defense Force took our film and they X-rayed it again and again and again and again and again until they tried to destroy the image in a way.
And you see that kind of green line that runs through the middle of the image? In a way, the IDF would have seen it as destroying the image. And when we first looked at the contacts from the 5x4, we were kind of shocked and thought, oh, they've destroyed this image. And it was only later we realized that that little green band of X-ray damage is actually the most important part of the image. And it alluded to something else that's quite important, is that we always think of photography as a kind of one moment in time that's seized and captured in this camera. But in fact, it continues to be written upon, and in a way the Israeli Defense Force kind of signed themselves onto this picture, which makes it all the more interesting.
So now we're jumping to a project that we did in South Africa a few years later. And we had this invitation, and a lot of the work that we were doing around this time was generated through assignments rather than through our own ideas. And we had this assignment to go back and photograph South Africa 10 years after apartheid. And so we went on this journey, and it was a real moment for us because Adam and I had been editing Colors magazine for years, and we'd been dipping into all these different sort of very photojournalistic sort of environments. And this was an opportunity for us to travel around South Africa and explore the place that we came from. And I think something about photography is you end up often in places that you're a stranger in that place. You're an outsider looking in. And for us it was a strange experience because we were both South African to different degrees, and we were going into this place that we felt was our home, but oddly we both felt like aliens there. And so this project was really about trying to navigate this relationship of us in relationship to the place that we come from.
I mean, it's interesting, this idea of the exotic and photography, because recently we did a conversation with David Goldblatt. I'm not sure how many of you know David's work. But he has, infamously stuck to South Africa and photographed in South Africa from the late 40s, and he's still shooting, and he's in his 80s. And I said to him, that Alexandra Township, which is one of the famous townships, just was about 200 meters from my house. And David spent a lot of time photographing in there in the 60s and 70s, when I was a kid, when I was just growing up, when I was just born. And his images kind of became the memory or the insight into a country that I was never given. And I said to him, Alexandra Township is much more kind of foreign and exotic for me, even though it was 200 meters from where I spent 15 years of my life, to Ramallah or Helmand province in Afghanistan. And his response was, Adam, if you had stayed, you wouldn't feel the same, But it's quite interesting, just this idea of what is the exotic.
And this is the most extreme, I suppose. This is a photograph taken in a prison in Cape Town. And this guy's name is Dion. He was a general in a gang in a prison called Pollsmoor. And you can tell that he's a general by looking at his tattoos. And he explained to us a really remarkable thing about vision, which was that in his gang there are all these different hierarchies. And to move up this hierarchy from the bottom to the top, you have to stab a warden with a blade. You have to stab one of the guards. And each time you move up, you're given a new uniform to wear. And the uniform is described to you in detail. The details of the belt, the details of the shoe, the kind of weapon that you hold. But of course, because you're in a prison, there is no uniform. It's completely imaginary. And so you wear this imaginary uniform, and everyone in the prison knows what you're wearing because they know what rank you are. And we just love that idea that the photograph, of what the photograph can't express and can't capture. And that's when we started really working with words a lot more, and words in relationship to our portraits.
This is Meet Blondie. So Blondie was one of the two transsexuals in the prison. She was actually Dion's so-called wife. And this was interesting as well, because going into these kind of environments with a camera, you immediately given a sense of authority. You have permission from the government to be in there. In this case, we also had permission from the gang leaders to go through the prison. But for some reason, and this is kind of one of the problems that we've always had with this particular moment of our practice, was that there's this kind of one-way power direction, that you behind the camera, the subject's in front. And in this case was a perfect example, because Blondie kind of confessed to 2 crimes to us that she had never told anyone about, as if we were some kind of route of salvation, that through this camera was a kind of way of, as if we were priests in a confessional or something. And that we experienced that quite a lot during this kind of period of our practice.
I think what we became aware of at this time was a lot of our subjects were very naive about what it meant to have your photograph taken, and the idea that a photograph is a currency, that you take a picture but then it has a value, and it suddenly enters into this economy of images and this system of distribution. And we realized that it became impossible for us just to make pictures without thinking about that whole system of distribution and currency. And it became important to try to bring ideas about the context of photography into the picture making, and not to be just kind of naive about it. We've just shown you a few portraits, and then sometimes people have sent us in the mail, they've sent us pictures they've done from our pictures. So
weird feedback, yeah.
We're just racing through some of this, and at the time we were reading a remarkable book called The Journalist and the Murderer by Janet Malcolm. And it's a beautiful, very short book, I really recommend it, which is about the relationship between journalists and the people they interview. And she asks a very simple question: why do people agree to be interviewed? Is it vanity? Is it because they want their story to be told? Is it because they don't want to disappear into the muddiness of history? Why do people confess to journalists?
Not only that, why do they open up to journalists when in fact they should be doing the opposite? They should be really closing down. And she was like always baffled by that. And similarly, we were always baffled by people's willingness to be photographed. And on the odd occasion when people would say no, it was actually quite a pleasant experience. And I think in order to try and kind of reverse, in a very rudimentary way, reverse this idea of the kind of power, one-way flow of power, we did an experiment in a psychiatric hospital in Cuba, where we just set up, the camera and the lights, and we just gave people a release cable and let them choose their position. So although it's kind of now, looking back, it seems quite a rudimentary, clumsy step, it was just the beginnings for us of kind of getting away from this position of authority. And I think Mario's response was particularly poetic, where he just turned his back and he took the picture.
So moving forward to a completely different project, we were invited to Iraq to work with a group of actors. This was just after the American invasion, so it was a moment, it was really the height of the insurgency in Iraq. And it was a very dangerous time to go there. And they had just, the first passenger airline had just started going into Iraq from Frankfurt airport. And so we went with this group of actors, half British, half Iraqi, to this place called Suleimania, which was in Kurdistan. And these groups were rehearsing in this building called the Red House, which, until we got there, we didn't realize was this building with this kind of very distressing history. It had been Saddam's headquarters all through his reign. And in the basement of this building, there were these solitary confinement cells where people had been tortured and kept in solitary confinement for many, many years. And we actually went to this place to do something completely different. But when we saw these drawings on the walls by prisoners, we were really struck by them and the idea that they sort of expressed some sort of unconscious interior vision of the conflict in Iraq.
I mean, just to mention how preposterous our original idea was, because we were there, what they were rehearsing, this co-Iraqi British actors, was a play written by Stravinsky at the turn of the century, which is a classic Faustian tale. So a soldier's coming home from an unknown war and he's playing his fiddle and he meets the devil and he swaps his simple fiddle for the book which is going to give him eternal life. And this is the play that we're rehearsing in this place. And Ollie and I literally took all the props and we were going to use soldiers and kind of actors to reenact it in this place. And we were stopped at the border smuggling in fake blood into Iraq. And it was like, you know, it was suddenly, it's kind of like when your kind of pretension meets the kind of reality of a situation. And like Ollie said, you know, when we saw these images on the walls, we kind of abandoned that plan and just focused on a kind of a simple but kind of quite arduous task of moving inch by inch with a 5x4 and just recording these drawings, because the walls were kind of falling down and it almost felt like a kind of archaeological project was just to preserve these drawings.
But it seemed ridiculous to go to a war zone and come back with these small little funny little doodles, but of course they relate very strongly with the work of Bresai and his graffiti, Second World War graffiti, and there's a whole history of this kind of documentation, and those images actually strangely look very similar as well, the kind of drawings, these kind of naive drawings. But what we were grappling with, what we were worried about at this time was, how do you take pictures of conflict? How do you photograph war? Do you go and photograph the most gruesome thing? Do you photograph dead bodies? Do you try to capture traces of violence in this way? Do you go to the aftermath after the event and look at the traces? How do you... Is it possible for the camera to somehow capture and communicate human suffering? And that was what we were really worried about.
And also another thing is kind of what we touched on earlier, talking about the role of evil in art. Is there space in art practice for evil where, you know, just going back to the last picture, it's like the amount of people have said to me, oh God, that looks like a Cy Twombly, you know? And it's kind of to impose this kind of history of modernist art history onto an image that's a document from a war zone. It all gets very confusing and very complicated. And those intersections, I think, become more increasingly interesting to us. I think this is jumping back in time, but after spending time in Ramallah, we were kind of quite convinced to go and do some work in Palestine and Israel, and coincidentally at the same time met a theorist called Eyal Weizman, who, although born in Israel and Jewish, is kind of blacklisted there because he, you know, of his kind of progressive and anti-Zionist or analytical revisionist history of Israel. And Eyal mentioned over dinner that when we met him one day about a place called Chicago, which is this remarkable place in the middle of the desert in Israel. And it's a 1-to-1 scale remake of a generic Arab village built for training, kind of urban warfare training. And ever since, I don't know if any of you have seen the Battle of Algiers, but ever since that moment when Occidental troops are inside an urban space that doesn't resemble their particular urban space, they're very vulnerable. And so what the Israeli military tried to do was mimic this kind of notion of a generic Arab village so that they would be, there's a picture of the actual, of Chicago, that they would be more able to navigate to.
What really struck us about this place was that its history mirrored the history of the conflict in the Middle East since the 70s. So in the early 70s, Israel invaded Lebanon, and they built this place at that time in order to train troops to fight in South Lebanon. And then as the war developed, you had the first and then the second Intifada. This place was expanded and developed to encompass parts of Ramallah and parts of Gaza. And then as time went by, Israel decided to pull out of the Gaza Strip. And this evacuation was rehearsed in Chicago, as was an attempted assassination of Saddam. And you know, what's really interesting is the development and building of this place mirrors all these military events that took place.
I think the kind of meta subject of the whole project, Chicago, which became a book, was that the whole project is kind of representations of representations. There's nothing actually real in the book. So, for instance, this image before we found inside Chicago is a blaxploitation poster that the Israeli Defense Force cut out, placed onto plywood and used as a sniper thing. But this notion of the projection of what the enemy looks like was very interesting to us.
And we noticed these shapes in a lot of the walls in this place, and we asked them, what are these things? And they explained to us that this is a representation of a hole that's been blown in a wall. And we were like, why have you got that? It looks like a Star of David. It really bemused us. But then they explained to us that the Israeli Defense Force had developed a technique called worming. And worming is this technique of moving through an urban area without exiting the buildings, without walking in the streets, without moving through doors or opening windows, without using what they call the normal syntax of a town. What they actually do is they walk through walls instead. And they use ultrasound technology to see what's through the wall, to make sure there's nobody on the other side, then blow a hole through it and step through in this way.
And you know, the general explained to us you can have up to 7,000 men moving through a city and they're not visible from the air. So what's also interesting is how Israel, in this case Chicago, but how Israel in general has become a kind of laboratory for, in this way, military kind of technology, but also ideological laboratory in a way.
And then if you think about Chicago as a kind of, it looked a bit like a film set, but with devoid of people, devoid of any details. These are kind of like the props in a way. We went to the bomb disposal unit in Jerusalem, and they showed us this little museum they've created of suicide bombs. So these are all bombs that were built by Palestinian bomb makers and then detonated in Israel. And then the Israeli Defense Force have then rebuilt these things in order to train their troops how to defuse bombs. And this little switch on there is called a Deadman Switch. And they explained to us that it was developed in response to an Israeli policy. So the IDF are trained that if they think that somebody is a suicide bomber, they immediately shoot them in the head to stop them. So the Palestinian bomb makers, aware of that policy, developed what they call the Deadman Switch. And what it is the suicide bomber goes out. In this case, the bomber went to a pizzeria in Jerusalem. He switches the switch on to activate it. And it's only when he lets go of the switch that it detonates. And what really struck us was this strange kind of almost exchange of information between the Israeli Defense Force and the bomb makers. There's this kind of evolution of technology that happens over time.
And one of the other chapters of Chicago, we were literally just driving between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and we saw a big sign saying Mini Israel. So everyone would take a turn when you see Mini Israel. And it turns out to be a 1 to 50,000 scale model of the so-called State of Israel, their idea of the State of Israel. And it's all moving. I mean, it's a remarkable place. So all these little models, you know, like you get mini lands in Shenzhen and everywhere. But one thing that really struck us is that a great portion of this mini land was buildings under construction. And that I've never seen before. And it just pointed to how important the notion of construction is in the psyche of the State of Israel, is that it's permanently kind of being built. And it's even the kind of, even that is represented in this mini land.
Okay, so now we're moving into a new project. Just to give you a little bit of background about this, we were invited to be on the judges of the World Press Photo Award in Amsterdam a few years ago, and we were quite surprised that they invited us because the photo award is for journalism, it's for war journalism, and I think they wanted to kind of broaden the prize, and so they invited us to judge. And so we spent a week in a dark room like this, looking at pictures, looking at 1 year of images of conflict. And over that time we looked at 81,000 images, together with 9 other judges. And in order for us to get through this huge volume of images, they developed a system which they actually got from a game show, like a TV game show that had gone out of business. And what it was is each person had a button, and the picture would flash up, and each of you would press a button to vote it in or vote it out. So, and it felt quite revolting actually to be looking at these pictures, because sometimes you'd have a picture of a soldier fighting, being shot, somebody being killed, a picture of dolphins jumping in the air, a photograph of somebody's cat, and you were kind of expected to somehow draw out of this what you considered to be the best picture.
But also, I mean, this prize is immensely powerful. It's like, I think they produce 60 different catalogues in 60 languages. They have a show of it that travels the world, so like 20 million people see it. But also, most importantly, all the photojournalists look at this. So the people who win the prize, it then governs the way that events are photographed the next year, you know what I mean? So we were just really puzzled and kind of shocked by this institution. And what we did is we broke the rules. We signed a kind of non-disclosure form before, saying we wouldn't reveal how the process works. And we were so kind of revolted by it that we published a big piece in a magazine about exactly how this thing works, because we were so appalled. And also, one thing that really struck us is this was just the beginning of the system of embedding. I don't know if you're familiar with what it means to be embedded, but during the first Gulf War in 1990, if you remember, no photojournalists were allowed to go in with the troops. And it was, Baudrillard called it the war that we saw on television. It was famously unphotographed. We saw it from these smart bombs, the cameras on that, and nobody saw an image. And America knew that the world would not tolerate this again. So, and they also noticed something really clever that they thought was really clever, and they made it institutional. But during the Falklands War, when the British soldiers went from Britain all the way to the Falklands, there was a 3-week journey by boat, and they had space for only 3 photographers. And they noticed that a real kind of emotional bond developed between these photographers and the soldiers, and that had a real impact on the way that war was imaged. So they cleverly institutionalized this kind of little situation, and they said, we will give you unprecedented access to the front line of a war if you come with us. So we chaperone you. You'll have see things nobody's seen since 1960, in Vietnam. But they will have control over what you photograph. And in fact, before we went, so we got ourselves embedded, but before we went, you have to sign a form saying you won't photograph any dead people, any wounded people, any signs of enemy fire. In fact, any signs of conflict are totally out of bounds, right? But you can go to the front line.
So as Adam's suggesting, we decided to go to the front line, and we went, after doing this prize and being disgusted by the kinds of images that are being produced in war zones, we decided to put ourselves in the same position as the thing that we were being quite critical of. So we got ourselves embedded with the British Army, and we went to Afghanistan, and we were taken all the way to Helmand province, and we ended up at the front line. But we decided that there was only one way for us to really be subversive as embedded journalists, as we'd signed this form, and that was to refuse to actually take pictures. And so instead of taking a camera, what we did was we took a box of paper, of photographic paper, and each time we were asked to take a picture, we would, instead of taking a picture, we would instead take out this paper and we expose it to the light and we put it back in. So there were all these episodes each day where we were taken to take a photograph that they wanted us to take, And instead of taking the picture, we did this strange thing of exposing light to paper. So, for example, on the first day, a translator for the BBC was executed, and we were taken to the scene of this execution, and we exposed this bit of paper. Well, on the third day, the 100th British soldier was killed, and as he was brought in on the helicopter to the army hospital, we were expected to be taking pictures, and we exposed this piece of paper.
I think it's quite important to mention that we got access to the military to be embedded by pretending, by lying, by saying we were journalists. And it's really interesting to see that the state feels, if we had said we're artists, we would not have got permission. That the state actually feels more comfortable allowing a journalist in to document a war than it would an artist at this point. And also just to mention that what we did is we co-opted all the armoured vehicles were vehicles for the British military designed for Northern Ireland in the 70s that they were using in Helmand province. And they've got 2 little apertures in the back, so we turned it into a darkroom. So essentially we take these kind of 6 or 7 hour trips, and that became our darkroom, and exposed these papers to the light in that.
We also made a film where we documented this box taking a journey from our studio in London all the way to the front line and back. And in a way that film is more interesting than these pictures, because what you see is this, we imagine there's like an invisible piece of elastic between the box and the camera, and the camera just follows it all the way. It gets in the taxi, it gets in the aeroplane, it arrives in Kabul. A soldier picks the box up, puts it on his shoulder, puts it in a tank, it goes into an aeroplane, it's carried into a helicopter, and it ends up in the front line. And the soldiers became actors in our little film. And although the camera is always pointing at the box, what you see around the box is war. And actually war is very boring. Nothing much happens most of the time, 99% of the time. So you see the kind of mundanity of conflict.
But it also functions like Hitchcock had this thing about a MacGuffin. I don't know if you've read about it, but you need a MacGuffin in every film, where it's the briefcase that somebody walks across. And it's never revealed what's inside, but there's this idea of the mystery that you need to kind of see.
Okay, so we, a little bit later, a few years later, we were invited to come and look at an archive about another war. This is a war in Northern Ireland. So we were invited to come and look at this archive of photographs that document the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So the Troubles between the early 1980s and the early 1990s. And it's a remarkable archive because it was produced by photojournalists who were from Belfast, and they were photographing their own community. And at the same time, they were teaching workshops to little kids and to teenagers and to adults who wanted to learn about photography. So it was like an amateur photography club. And these two kinds of pictures, the pictures by the amateurs and the pictures by the photojournalists, got mixed up and muddled together in this archive that we then encountered in a kind of little dark room.
Another thing we noticed is that the kind of markings, so in this case the stickers, but sometimes kind of scratches. And we started looking at this archive almost in architectural terms. So if you imagine, instead of looking at something in plan, we would look at it in section. And we turned the paper on its side like this. And in this instance, we noticed the layer above, which is all these little blue stickers, you get in a stationery store. And every time a photo editor would go in and choose a picture that they wanted to use, they'd put a sticker, or an archivist said, this is important, we need to reproduce it, bum, a sticker. And Ollie and I just got to thinking that, ironically, although this was open to the public, the only pieces or only parts of the image never seen were actually the elements under these little stickers. So we kind of made almost a musical score that dictated, and then we made, what would you call this? A kind of mask. And we went into the darkroom, retrieved the negatives, and printed simply what was under those little stickers, just as a gesture of kind of revealing what's been hidden by
and while we were printing these, we would put them out to dry, like in this darkroom, and people would be coming through, and they would look at the pictures, and somebody would go, that's Sean's foot, I remember that, because they would see a little detail, and they would immediately be reminded of the bigger picture. But many of the pictures became quite mysterious, because it was really impossible to know where the picture came from. And what was starting to emerge was this kind of other history of the Troubles that was being built up through these fragments. So this was kind of a way of finding a new reading of the archive in a funny way.
And then just back to the architectural kind of looking in section, is we noticed a lot of the images had been damaged, so either cut out or scratched out. And it was people who had gone to, say, a funeral and didn't want to be photographed. And they'd gone into this public archive and kind of scratched themselves out. But it's just a symbolic gesture because, of course, the negative is underneath. Are you all surviving?
Yeah. Have you got some water? Yeah. What time are we running till? How are we doing on time?
Should we do one or two more and then stop for next time? So, I mean, a lot of our practice happens by accident, and we had a show in Rome of that work that we made in Iraq, and this tiny woman came up to me and said, you gotta meet my nephew in New York, Josh Prager. And we're like, all right. And next thing we kind of got an email, or we got in touch, and it turns out that Josh Prager was really remarkable. He was a Wall Street journalist for the Wall Street Journal, and he had seen at a friend's house a book of Pulitzer Prize winning pictures. And he went through this thing and he noticed that only one picture in the 70 years or whatever of the history of this prize, it was noted anonymous. And this was the picture. It was about a month after the revolution in 79 in Iran. And it shows the execution of 11 Kurdish resistors, however you want to put them, Kurdish men by Khomeini's soldiers. And it was published the day after this young photojournalist took this picture in the front page of Etilat, which was the national newspaper. And the editor was really concerned about how the regime would deal with this picture because it was evidence of them killing Kurds. So he didn't put a name of a photographer. And then the next day it was in the New York Times and the Guardian and the blah, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, but nobody knew their identity. And this guy Josh spent about 4 years finding the photographer, and it turned out to be a man called Razmi, who was in his 60s now and a wedding photographer in the suburbs of Tehran.
So yeah, we went to meet Razmi, and we had a couple of questions we wanted to ask him. We were interested to know how he remembered this event, why he had done this strange, why he had taken the photograph from this angle, and what was his memory of the event, and how did the memory sort of relate to the picture that ended up becoming so famous. And he said to us, I'll show you the other pictures I took, because I didn't just take one picture. I took 27 pictures on a roll. And I actually walked around this thing, and I photographed it from every angle. So he showed us these other pictures. And we produced a collage where we sort of, it's almost like trying to dissect and analyze exactly what happened from every angle. We show you.
If you look at the man on the right, can you see him, the blindfolded man all the way on the right? So every time he appeared in one of Razmi's pictures, we would cut him out and place him as close to the proportion as he was in the frame into this thing. And these things, just to explain, are kind of squeezed between two pieces of glass, and they're kind of not as flat, and they're more tactile than that. But they're really an attempt at kind of analyzing Razmi's movements, and to also dissect. There's a famous, someone was talking about Pierre Huyghe earlier, but Pierre in one of his talks, I heard, quoted Pasolini. Somebody asked Pasolini, what would your ideal film be? And he said it would be the assassination of Kennedy, but from many angles. Because we've all seen that assassination, but we've all seen it from one angle. And in a way, this was an attempt at that, because what we're quite interested in is how kind of history coagulates around one image, and it's embedded in our minds, you know, and that was one of them. And how do you break that down? I mean, equally, it's a really disturbing project because it kind of highly aestheticizes something so kind of traumatic, and that's something that we, you know, quite often have to deal with in criticism and with ourselves, in a way.
So is this the last series in this thing? No, it's not, no. Okay, we started showing this to our group, so sorry if there's a bit of overlap, but this is the project that we've just finished, and it's on show at the moment in our gallery in London. And the whole project began with this image. This is a woman called Shirley, and she was photographed by Kodak in the late 1950s. She was working for Kodak. She was one of the receptionists. And they needed a photograph of white skin in order to distribute this picture around America, so that all the different labs around the country were able to produce properly white skin. So they took a picture of her and they put at the bottom, it's hard to see there, but it says normal, and they distributed this picture of normal Caucasian skin.
And what's quite interesting, at the end of segregation in America, for the first time white and black kids were photographed in the same picture. And if they took a meter reading for the white kid, which they would obviously do, the black kid was rendered almost invisible except for the whites of the eyes and the teeth. And what it became apparent is that Kodak film couldn't cope with the kind of breadth of light to dark, and couldn't render accurately particularly kind of darker shades. But they didn't address this at all until two of their biggest clients complained. So the furniture industry complained that you couldn't photograph yellow wood next to teak. It didn't accurately do it. And the confectionery industry, the chocolate industry, complained. And so Kodak then began to address this thing. And one of the films, we grew up with, Kodak Gold, was the first consumer film that could actually cope with this thing. So
when Kodak developed this film, they tried to market it, and of course they didn't want to say this film is good for photographing black skin. But so instead they said this film is good for photographing the details of a dark horse in low light, which is a kind of coded way of saying black skin.
But coincidentally, at the same time, we were invited on one of these strange kind of commissions that we sometimes get and mostly say no to, but we said yes to this one because we were doing this research at this time. But it was to go to Gabon, and Gabon's kind of West Central Africa next to Congo, Equatorial Guinea, to document the country. So somebody had rounded up 10 of what they thought were kind of good photographers to go into this place and document the country and make a book out of it. But what we decided to do was kind of turn the concept on its head, and we spent a few months collecting unexposed Kodak film from the 1950s, so the so-called racist film. And there's quite an interesting story that in 1977, Jean-Luc Godard was invited by Samora Michel to go to Mozambique. It was just post-independence Mozambique, and there was no television station. And he invited Godard, he invited Jean Rouch and Ray Guerra, who's a radical Brazilian filmmaker, to come and to develop a television station. And Godard famously refused to use Kodak because he said it's endemically racist film. So we took the so-called racist film, and that's the only color film we took. And we traveled for kind of 5 or 6 days into the middle of the primary rainforest to photograph a kind of very rare, your classic ethnographic mission, a very rare ritual that happens in Gabon.
And obviously this film was very unstable and very old, and we didn't know the history of the film or whether the film had been kept in refrigerators or anything about the film because we'd bought it online. And it was a risk because we were making this long trip into the rainforest to photograph something very rare, and there was a risk that nothing would come out. And in fact, almost nothing did come out except this one frame on one film, which luckily is actually quite an important picture because it shows a photograph of this palm leaf that is kind of put in the middle of the ceremony as kind of the main thing. And that's the only thing that came out. But actually, we wouldn't have minded if it had all been blank. We could have exhibited just the blankness.
So this idea of kind of anthropology and ethnography has always been kind of something that's concerned us and worried us. And this was a more theatrical performance of this ritual we're talking about with Kuiti that happened in Libreville. And we took this photograph and left the camera there and asked them to take a photograph of us. And we created this little child's toy that is in the exhibition. And we've called this thing Nudniks. And there's a famous Yiddish writer called Isaac Bashevis Singer, and he talks about a nudnik in literary terms, where somebody places themselves as the writer, as the most important character in a piece. And that's particular, reference to the kind of history of anthropology.
Yeah, so you kind of go up there and you fiddle with the thing and you push it up. But then another thing happened while we were working on this project, where a friend of ours' father passed away, and he had been an anatomist and an amateur photographer, and he had in his house, he had this darkroom. And he was like, my father was the same. I think it's a very male thing, this idea when you grow up that your dad kind of goes into the darkroom and he prints all the family pictures. And he's mixing chemicals, and there's something very mysterious about this amateur photographic space. And in fact, when I was a kid, my bedroom was turned into the darkroom, so I kind of grew up in a darkroom. And this guy's dad was the same. He'd started off colonizing the bathroom, and then when the kids had grown up, he moved the entire darkroom into one of the bedrooms, and this thing had kind of expanded, and his hobby had become his kind of main passion.
But I mean, what's quite interesting is that his name was Dr. Rosenberg, and we're both of Lithuanian Jewish descent, and he kind of, shared a whole lot of our origins and obsessions and kind of weird oddities. And it was almost as if kind of accepting this darkroom, which we then reconstructed piece by piece and perfectly, accurately as he had in our studio. We kind of got possessed by Dr. Rosenberg, and we started applying all of his rules, but meticulously exactly the rules that he had applied to his test, to all of the images that we had taken in Gabon. So the rest of the images that appear in the show are kind of channeled by Dr. Rosenberg, if you like.
We also kind of decided, let's forget about the final perfect image and embrace a little bit more just the process of making the image. So we said, okay, here's a test strip, that we made in order to do a print. But in fact, we lost interest in the print itself and decided that actually the test strip was the work. And so all of the work, these works in the show, are these very, very large test strips that have been, the scale has been increased.
Well, one of the themes of this workshop that we're running is this idea of magic. And it was, I think, over the years we've got increasingly cynical about the medium of photography. And this was kind of one moment of I don't know, of magic for us, because we gave this picture to somebody we knew who was leaving from a museum in London and going to work in a museum in New York, and we happened to just print this thing and give it to her, and she wrote this really touching email saying, I was so moved by this image of this woman packing her car and leaving on a journey, especially because she had a BlackBerry tucked between her breasts, and we hadn't noticed that, and only when we blew it up. And we wrote in the kind of theme for you about how Benjamin talks about this optical unconscious, about the kind of this the last little bit of magic in photography is that you think you're controlling what you're taking a picture of, but the lens always includes what you're trying to exclude in a way. And so that was like one moment of kind of joy for us in a way. And then there's a lot of other themes. I mean, this was in the Museum of Ethnography in Gabon. I mean, the most famous masks in the world, the Fang mask, which cost hundreds of millions in the Met Museum. The Museum of Ethnography was absolutely empty except for kind of one or two just disheveled pieces of thing. But this notion of our need to preserve culture, which is very much an imposed thing, and also part of kind of photography, how we need to preserve and document. And this, I was having a haircut, and Ollie went wandering off and found this kind of weird factory of plaster casts of almost like a Hegelian notion of Western white beauty that was on sale, and was in loads of houses that we visited.
And this is, I mean, all of you who've worked in a darkroom will know what this is. It's a dodger. It's an old pre-Photoshop way of controlling the light on a print. And Dr. Rosenberg, this father of our friend, had all these dodgers in his, darkroom. And what's really lovely about this the dodger is that it has this indexical relationship to the image. You cut the shape of it exactly to fit the image, and you use it so for every image there's this corresponding dodger piece of equipment that you put there. And we decided to use all of his dodgers almost like a mask to obscure. And the reason for that was all of these people agreed to have their picture taken, but then they got very uncomfortable with it, and they decided that they weren't sure about it, and they felt that the whole thing was very private, and so we just placed this thing on top of them in a way to obscure them.
This is Dr. Rosenberg's brilliant invention, where he just put a piece of string like that, and he would dry all his prints like that. So we just used it as a mode of representing the work. And this was another kind of little short series where we took these pictures of these initiates, and they were kind of uncomfortable, and just in the studio, we were never going to use these, kind of cut them out. We're left with this like bowl of kind of really weird images of, you know, cliched notion of a kind of African kid, and then just kind of, just literally put them against an image of where they were photographed against. So this is kind of very much work in progress, and the next thing, again, a kind of weird coincidence, is we just found out that Polaroid, in 1970 there was an African-American photographer but also employee of Polaroid, and he noticed that in 1970 Polaroid earned $100 million, but one of those $100 million came from South Africa, and that seemed ludicrous to him. And he noticed that Polaroid was supplying South Africa with their machines and their film to take pictures of all non-white South Africans to put in the passbook. And those of you who don't know, the passbook was this infamous, like, detested document that every non-white citizen had to carry with them. If they were caught without it, would be jailed or disappeared. And so he began to campaign alongside his wife to pull out of South Africa. It took them many years, but by 1977 they got Polaroid to actually withdraw out of South Africa, and that was ultimately the beginning of the anti-apartheid movement. And that was the first company to withdraw, but ultimately the withdrawal of international companies led to the end of the
So
regime.
what we've done, this is something that we're going to do in January, but we've managed to buy the original Polaroid camera. It's called the ID2 camera that was used to make these photographs, ID photographs. And you can buy them on the internet. They're not very expensive. And they're very nice because they take two pictures on the same Polaroid strip, and you can control one or two at the same time. And it comes with instructions, how to take the perfect passport photograph. You mustn't smile, you must always look in front of the camera, you mustn't turn your head, you mustn't wear a hat. And we just want to undo all of those don'ts and make them positive. So use this piece of equipment to photograph the most intimate things and create juxtaposition. So that's something that we'll show you in January when we have our Skype meeting.
There's a few more projects, but should we
I think maybe we
stop
should
there?
Stop there.
Or how do you feel? Quite a lot to take in.
I think it would be more interesting maybe to have people
to have some conversation. Yeah, and there's two more projects we can present on another occasion.
Yeah?
So does anyone have any questions?
Or answers?
Don't be shy.
Nothing?
Is there anything any of you didn't understand or was a bit confusing?
Question?
Yeah.
Do you? I find very interesting the strategies you have and how you talk about the relationship in the beginning of this project when you're talking about a relationship with people that you take pictures of and how you relate that to journalism and how people are so willing to be taking pictures of them. I was just wondering if you work with video as well, and how was that experience, if ever?
We've made some films, video films, but they tend to be. We tend to use video to describe our process. They're almost like documentation of how we work, and we're not quite sure why we do them.
We've never kind of paid the medium enough respect, but in fact we've made a film on video for every project.
I mean, the video we described for the work in Afghanistan is probably the most considered film video that we made, and it was very integrated to the work.
But there was another one that we made in Mini Israel, which kind of shows the movement and things, and that was recently showed in Beirut, and because it has the Israeli flag and it has the Israeli national anthem, it went to court, and it went until 4 in the morning. This court case about because it's illegal to play the national anthem there, and it was an interesting debate because it's something that obviously was conceived of as a critical piece of work, but needn't come across like that. So, in a way, that film is important. And I think for every project we've made a little film, but we've never thought of ourselves as kind of filmmakers, so we've never given it any credibility or, you know what I mean, importance. And that's quite nice. It's nice to feel free of that, you know?
Yeah, there's so much that is outside the frame. Then I just wonder if in your exhibitions you don't feel like tempted to include somehow all this that is outside the frame.
We do. So the answer is we do. But
we do feel tempted.
No, we do include videos.
We do sometimes include videos, but it's a good question because how much do you tell about something? And I think we used to have quite an anxiety about that. You know, if somebody looks at the picture, you know, do they understand that this is a piece of paper that went to Afghanistan, or do they understand that this was taken during a very rare ritual on very old film? And what we've realized is that when a piece of work is good and it goes out and it gets shown, the story and the narrative attached to it kind of goes with it. And when the work gets written about and talked about, it gets kind of automatically contextualized. And so we kind of feel less anxious about having to put all that information there.
Especially that one that you expose the film. If you don't have the history of it, I mean, the project is the whole thing.
Yeah, and the film is super important. But we've had a lot of arguments about that film, and it's because of our inexperience. Like, that project was shown in a show curated by Harun Farouki. I don't know if you know him, but he's a filmmaker. And he refused to show the film, and the project's toured in museums since 2008 when we did it, and he's the only person to refuse because he said it's not a conceptual piece of work because we've edited it. He said if you were really conceptual, you would have switched the camera on and followed that box for all 14 days you were there and then switched it off. And you know, so that's his amount of rigor, and we're not that rigorous in that medium, you know what I mean? We hadn't even considered that.
So how important is reality? I mean, you just could make up the stories and then make a picture to it, for example, for many of the stories you told. I mean,
we could have, and we have. I mean, some of what we've said is true and some of it isn't. I think that uncomfortableness is, you know, we're kind of interested in that space between truth and fiction. Because I think every image, no matter how real it looks, has built into it some sort of level of falsity and theatricality and fiction.
But I don't think fiction is like primary on the surface in our practice, like Walid Rad's.
That's the way it's seen, that's the way it comes over.
Right.
It's about the story.
Right. But I can tell you we were in Helmand province,
Yeah.
for instance. That much I can tell you.
I got a question concerning the embedded journalist, because I found it very interesting that the military actually allows journalists to be embedded, but it does not allow artists to be embedded. So I found that very interesting, because like in the industry, it's completely different. If you got a big company, they all want artists. They want embedded artists.
Yeah,
they want artists to show to
endorse,
the companies.
Yeah.
So they actually, but they never allow journalists to be embedded.
Yeah.
So I was maybe you got an idea, an answer to that question. So why do big companies want the artists and the military they don't want them? Because if you send a conceptual artist to the front line, he probably won't do take images of wounded soldiers or so.
I think that's a great question, and I think probably capital is the ultimate conflict zone, you know, and I think that's the real terrifying space. And in fact, I don't know. We recently had a chat with a filmmaker called Renzo Martins. Have you ever heard of him? He did a film called Enjoy Poverty, which analyzes the kind of economy of images down from the lowest image of somebody in Congo taking a passport picture which costs $1, to a photojournalist charging $100 of a starving child, to an artist selling a picture for $100,000 in a gallery. And but ultimately Renzo's failure is he doesn't expose the exposition of his work, you know, which is an edition of 3, which is on sale for a certain amount of money. So he stops at the point where the art world capital kind of happens. And I think it's a great point.
It's a great question, and the simple answer is that the military can control journalists because there's a tacit agreement and an understanding. But they can't control artists, and that's why the artist is seen as a much more threatening and subversive character.
But I think there's certain artists that, you know, Mercedes-Benz would not invite into their factory. There definitely are some artists I can think of. So, you know, there's certain artists that are like an endorsement, full of kudos, you know.
What is your background? Like, what did you do before you started to make art? Are you coming from the photography, or did you study like anthropology or something, or history?
I studied sociology and history of art.
Yeah, and I studied philosophy and computer science.
So no art at all, which, you know, I really regret not having had that opportunity. And I think, you know, I think a lot of our work has unfortunately like inflicted a learning process that could have happened better in a school on the public. No, but it's taken a long time to kind of catch up, you know. It feels to me.
I think you're still catching.
Definitely. Yeah.
And the medium is either a book or an exhibition.
So far, yeah.
Yeah, and commodities. You know, because those exhibitions get broken up and bought by weird people in Bahrain sometimes, you know. So it's, yeah. So it's, but yeah, essentially, yeah, those are the two outcomes that we can control.
But historically, we started off being more interested in books. And then people began to ask us to exhibit our pictures, so we would take the stuff off the books and put it on the wall. And we would take the caption and put it on the wall. So we did this kind of very stupid kind of book on the wall thing. And we did a whole solo exhibition at the Photographers Gallery like that, which we regret, obviously. And then gradually we began to realize that the book was not necessarily the end point of a photographic project, and that the gallery space was an end in itself. And our practice moved away from bookmaking in a way, and is now much more focused on creating exhibition spaces. And I think the relationship with work is so different in a space than in a book, and requires a kind of very different approach. Well, in fact,
the aspect of really physically going into situations where everybody would say, well, you better be careful, or this could be really inflicting. How important is?
I think it's very important, and I think our negotiation with power is primary. So, and I think most of the lying we do is less in the work than in the proposal. So we'll try and kind of keep that back and negotiate our way in. But that's as it's getting increasingly more difficult. Like we tried to do something with the Pentagon recently, and it's like it's clear that we're not going to do what they need to be done.
And the state of Gabon are not very interested in Dr. Rosenberg's tests, and they've rejected that completely. So that's probably kind of.
But you're right. This thing, and it's quite an intimate thing, and it's not. It's like we did spend 2 weeks with soldiers in the boiling heat talking about this project, and some were absolutely incredulous, and other people were understood it and got the humor and got the critique and got the and were willingly took part in it. But the main attack we get for that project is that we kind of conceptual pranksters playing in the real world, you know? Whereas I see it as a very serious, it's not a game, it's very serious. Why should I respect that world in that way? Why is there this ultimate authority, you know, at that point? So it's kind of, it's art and that are seen as just not compatible at all. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's constantly this kind of weird negotiation. And I think Oli and I play a role like that, you know, with the Israeli Defense Force at some point. You know, I had to go off and kind of keep them busy and pretend to be filming, and Oli's running around kind of taking pictures, and it's this kind of weird counterinsurgency feeling, you know.
We did this to get into Chicago. We did this deal with the Israeli Defense Force that we would teach a workshop, quite similar to the one we're doing here, to the Israeli Defense Force photography unit. So essentially a group of soldiers who are producing propaganda. And that was really, really difficult because it was impossible to critique their work because they were producing propaganda.
But we tried to talk about criticism and criticality, and and we also tried to look for certain images that Eyal Weizmann needed that he couldn't find anywhere else.
You mentioned like the commissions that you get. So who are actually the commissioners? So what kind of person is that? Is it that?
I mean, we
get a certain type of commissioner, or is it like from very different backgrounds?
Quite different. We get less and less. This thing from Gabon is the first one in years and years, actually. So this one was, the most bizarre story. A man who spent 6 years living in the primary rainforest with gorillas, and somehow befriended the dictator's son, who was an environmentalist. And the longest-running dictator in Africa dies, and of course his son gets elected. So this guy finds himself kind of close to the president, and started this project and invited some, Guy Tillim, a South African, who's known, he's not an uncritical, unintelligent, he's brilliant photographer. So invited people he knew would come up with stuff that would challenge the regime. And it's no surprise that the project's been thrown out. And so it's quite impressive that he did it, but somehow he did it. I don't know.
But that was quite peculiar. And then more in the past, magazine commissions would send us to places. Like the work that we did in Rwanda began as a magazine assignment to do something on the genocide museums. And then we ended up finding something that interested us. So different ways. I mean, the work in Afghanistan actually began. We did a small little assignment doing portraits of British soldiers that had limbs blown off. So we went to the hospital outside London where they rehabilitate these soldiers, and we took these portraits of these soldiers that were in the Guardian magazine. And the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, contacted us and said, "We'd like you to go to Afghanistan to photograph soldiers in a heroic way."
But they promptly refused that. Refused then.
Yeah. And that's when we started thinking about it. But then, they looked at our website and they were like, actually, it's not. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for listening.
Thanks.
Okay.